All right. Hello and welcome to the last session of today, of the second day of the European Vegan Summit. Well, last one if we don't count the movie projection that will take place just after. But this panel is called From Kitchen to Future, and it will be a bit of a different format. It's a one-on-one. I like to think about it as a fireside chat, an evening conversation, at least evening in Europe. But ultimately, it will be an interview that will deal with the topic of the future of plant-based food and eating. But if we talk about the future, we need to also tackle a little bit of the past and a lot of the present. So we will cover a lot of topics today, but I have the honor of having a guest that is a perfect person to take us on this journey towards this plant-based food revolution. But before I introduce her, I would like to briefly introduce myself. My name is Lena Kuklińska. I'm the project and program officer at the Federation of Young European Greens. But maybe more importantly, I'm for the largest part an animal rights activist. I have been for a couple of years now. I have been also part of the Green Roof Institute, and this is my third European Vegan Summit, for which I'm very glad and very happy to see this project evolve. And aside from that, I'm also part of Anonymous for the Voiceless and Feline Guardians, an organization that combats cat torture rings in China and more widely in Asia. And I think one thing that I have in common with our speaker, our guest today, is the fact that I'm an advocate, and so is Nina Curtis, the director and executive chef of Plantish & Co. Culinary Arts, a person with 2 decades of culinary experience, culinary excellence experience, who has been named one of the 25 top women in food service and hospitality for this year, who has been also honored as America's top hospital chef in 2020. And on top of that, in 2023, Chef Curtis curated a historic plant-based menu at the invitation of the First Lady, Dr. Joe Biden, honoring Prime Minister Narendra Modi, which took place in the White House. Nina is also part of American Culinary Corps, James Beard Foundation and State Department initiative. But as I said, on top of everything, she's a vegan advocate. And what strikes me the most, what I think will also be quite evident during our conversation, is that she advocates with a lot of kindness and understanding. And that's a very powerful thing. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. And welcome, Nina. It's an honor to have you here.
Oh, I'm so excited to be here, Lena. It's a pleasure to be able to talk with you and get to share some of our commonalities. I'm very thankful to the Rev Institute for having me, Green Rev, and the European Vegan Summit. I shared with you, I've tried to transport myself to Poland with you guys because I'm a very visual person, and I'm thankful for the Vegan FTA for sponsoring this. But I'm really excited to get into our conversation. And, I'm sitting in the US right now. It is about 11, what time is it? 11:20, 11, almost 11:30 a.m. So I have a full day ahead when you may be winding down a little bit. And every morning I wake up, I think, how can I be better than my best to serve as a global citizen?
It's a beautiful introduction. I'm really excited for our conversation. So let's jump in, if you don't mind.
Yes.
Perfect. So I said that to arrive in the future, we need to focus also on the present. And I wouldn't be myself if I didn't ask about about American politics, the current electoral run. I think a lot of people around the world are following it and wondering what will happen. But I'm not going to ask you about politics directly, but I wanted to ask about, because you have experience with politicians, you have been around them, you cooked for them. So I was wondering about what are your thoughts on the on the food served for the president. Do you think that there is a possibility that the White House will, and when, if so, go vegan? And why hasn't it been done so far? Are politicians not aware? Are they scared of introducing one diet over another? Diet, well, I define veganism as something more, but you know what I mean. So I'm wondering what is your experience and what are your thoughts based on your experiences at that high level?
Yeah. I'd have to say before I was invited by First Lady Dr. Jill Biden to come and curate a fully plant-based menu, I probably in my head thought that will never happen. I just didn't, have that in my wheelhouse or my bucket because for the United States, and I would think this would go for other governments, there is this diplomacy, that they want to display. And we could get into a debate about if that is the case. But once I got there and being able to curate a menu for Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who is a strict vegetarian, I tell people while he's a strict vegetarian, it was a vegan menu. Because for me, if you say, oh, well, I'm vegetarian, I've got all kind of milks for you. I've got plant-based eggs for you. So there's nothing I can't curate that I don't think you'll be pleased with or even know that there's something different or missing. I don't think anything misses today where we're at with regards to plant-based food and the execution of it. And the feedback that I got afterwards, because that really matters, right? You can serve a plate, and there were over 400 guests. It really made me walk away from that evening and maybe stay up a bit in my hotel, just really being able to imagine that, yes, the White House could go fully plant-based. Now, the prediction of time, I will not pull out a glass ball and try to predict that. But it did help me to realize that while I'm very compassionate for humanity and animal welfare and a place for all of us to live, probably from a very intellectual point of view, we have to look at, like you said, our history. We have to associate vegan food, which I call plant-based, because as you said earlier, veganism is a lifestyle for us. But we have to show its health benefits. We have to show its economic benefits. And we have to show its cultural benefits. Because if you look at any of the oldest cultures, we're already going to see India being one. We're already going to see this history of an abundance of plant-based food already. If we look far enough back in history, we know that meat on the plate was a condiment. We're now in the US, it's taking over 50%. So we have to look, I think, working in the hospital, I know we have to look at the situation of subsidies that the hospitals get. When we talk about politicians, the lobbyists in Washington and around, I'm going to speak very frankly, dairy and meat, animal agriculture, they have big dollars and they've been at this a while. So we have to get our politicians, and while there are vegan politicians, in government, I watch their moves. I watch their moves and how they address situations, them personally as a vegan, and then subtly, how do we make these changes? But the fact that I was able to create an all plant-based dinner, and while, if you look at the menu, there was a fish added. I didn't cook that. That wasn't a part of my menu. But I understand again, the diplomacy was to make sure no one felt like they had to go one night, one meal without animal flesh protein. And that's what I define it as, animal flesh protein, just like plant-based protein. I think we have to get over calling, and it's a huge thing in media. It's a huge thing in our industrial situations where they say protein and you just assume it's animal-based. So there's a lot of education that needs to continue to be done. I know politicians are afraid of, or I'll say hesitant. They may be hesitant to the backlash, of the people that have maybe funded their initiatives and supported them. It's kind of, I'll pat your back, you pat my back. I'm speaking very frankly because I think we all need to realize this, and maybe we know it, but I'm not afraid to call it out. We have to change our ideals of moving forward. We cannot be concerned about the environment and keep out the component of how huge food has an impact on it. And the studies and all that we know today, it's not a thought, it's not a little study here and there. It has grown exponentially in my research and studies, proving that we could probably really conquer hunger if we weren't feeding animals the foods that we need to feed humans. So now it's just not an animal welfare thing, it's a human welfare thing. I think we have to again focus on health care, hospital being the largest. I don't know why anybody should come out of a surgery for heart surgery and be served meat. Any cardiologist knows that's a problem. And I can't speak for them, but I know there's a lot pending on people and maybe their hesitance of, will this lose my job? We've seen that. But I am inspired based on the fact every time someone reaches out to me to talk about this dinner that, again, I wouldn't have thought in my lifetime it might have happened, but it did. So that gives that crack in the door for me to try to keep pushing and keep my foot in the door, not to let it close.
All right, perfect. Um, I mean, I think the situation in the US is very similar to the one in Europe, especially to Brussels, where European Union is essentially centered, and the lobby is huge. And this is a problem because politicians start to interact with lobbyists, and that then, as you said, there's this relationship of I helped you, you helped me, and that's a never-ending cycle. So I think it's very important to support politicians who are brave enough to go around and try to circle the system of very direct access. But that's a very general
Yeah.
advice. But you also mentioned hospitals, and I wanted to ask you because in Poland, the Green Reef Institute is running a campaign where we are reaching out to local authorities to try to introduce plant-based options in schools to start somewhere, right? To teach kids good practices and just serve them properly healthy food. But I was wondering about the availability of such meals in in US schools or hospitals in any public spaces. What's the situation?
Yes. In both of those lanes, I'll call them, New York has passed a bill in the Senate, S 996, that hospitals have to provide plant-based meals. So I think that's very exciting because we know if you get the East Coast, New York, and the West Coast, typically California, everyone else kind of follows the lead. It's kind of like, let Mikey try it. Let's see how this is going to happen and turn out. So we have that there. When I worked for the organization that I did, it was a healthcare corporate office here in Northern California where I was recruited. They operate 23 hospitals and they are a part of the Blue Zones. And in 2020, they actually purchased the Blue Zones because their congregation, Seven-Day Adventist, are the only Blue Zones in Loma Linda, California, of the 5 Blue Zones. And they've just included Singapore. They just announced that. So when we look at the Blue Zones, and Plant Slant has been and studied over 20 years, a huge part of, the commonalities of what centenarians and people that are living the longest were eating. And we go back to cultural foods. We go back to not just the food component, but we go back to movement. We go back to purpose. What does someone get up for in the morning? Do they feel good or do they have aches and pains? Typically, we have more people with having aches and pains, and they depend on drugs that we know really aren't working. It's suppressing the problem. It might be a bit addictive. But throughout my work as a Blue Zone speaker, which I still am, we really lean into not just what's on the plate. So when someone comes to me and says, what do I have to sacrifice? I'm like, nothing, nothing. just add XYZ to your plate every day because it's a form of crowding out. Where if I get you to have enough fresh fruits and vegetables with fiber and macronutrients and micronutrients and antioxidants and phytonutrients, you're going to start feeling better and you're going to start to lessen the need for the cravings that you might have. I'll have people tell me, I would rather die than give up my you fill in the blank. But that is what's happening. You probably will. And I never say that to anyone, but we lean in with compassion. We meet people where they're at. So I think more hospitals, Kaiser here in the States has a whole plant-based kitchen where they are teaching cooking classes and they are, passing out pamphlets. So the doctors are being trained to speak with patients about more fruits. I like to lead with vegetables and fruits because your fruits are doing the cleansing and your vegetables are doing the building. And that's what someone really needs. So I see in the future more whole plant-based food prescriptions being written out, but doctors need to be educated. They may get a week of nutrition in their medical schooling, if that. And then they have to go on to decide lifestyle training and lean into more, diet influenced studies, which in the States, I see a lot more of that. You see doctors writing books about food, and that's great. We want it to be appropriate, though. We get a lot of trendy, we can name every diet that I've experienced here in the United States, and it sells and it's a trend. It's really to me a fad. Con today, here today, gone tomorrow. With regards to the school, it's really exciting because again, California and New York are leading the way. California in 2021 secured $700 million to go towards unified school districts to improve the infrastructure and the ability for these schools, equipment and all, to be able to provide healthier diets. And the Los Angeles School District is really leading that charge here on the West Coast. And then in New York, in 2022, they started Plant-Based Friday. So every Friday, New York schools are offering a plant-based meal. Now, we may want to go in and look at what that is, and hopefully it's more than pizza with plant-based cheese. But I have several colleagues on the East Coast that are going in and teaching and working with chefs so that they also realize that you can make delicious food that's full of texture and full of taste, because that's what no one should miss out on. My dad is a chef. He's not a plant-based chef, but through these years, I've convinced him to eat more plant-based foods, especially when someone has a health scare, they're willing to listen a bit more. So we have, these grassroots initiatives for 3 years consecutive. When I moved up to Sacramento, there is the food literacy that works with grades 4 to 6. And every year they have the veggie of the year. So they will get 5 chefs in the area that are pretty prominent. And then one year I got cauliflower. So I made cauliflower nuggets with a plant-based dressing. And one of the kids was like, I don't do dairy. And I was like, but it's not dairy. And he just was really like, I don't believe you. And then one year I got collard greens, and you're like, oh my gosh, how am I going to get kids to want a collard green? But I blanched it. I made a chickpea tuna inside. And every year I've placed on some level. And my last year I got mushrooms, portobello mushrooms. So I did these mushroom sliders and made beet chips. And I say that to say kids are very inquisitive about food. They like colors. They like to know. They may look at you a little side eye, like, what are you serving me? But I had one young student say, this is the best burger I've had in my whole life. And I thought, how many burgers have you had in your whole life? But I took it, and it was very exciting.
Amazing. It's wonderful to hear. I mean, I'm also getting hungry. While we were speaking, I started getting hungry. Um, But thank you for sharing. I mean, I hope this is also an inspiration for some of our viewers, what they can make if they're looking for some inspiration. Though I bet you have way more. I mean, in our previous conversation, you also described a lot of dishes to me, and I had to go make myself second dinner. But I wanted to ask because you mentioned schools and hospitals, and then I started thinking about the industry as such. So vegan restaurants, vegan cafes. I was wondering how it's going in the US because I know that in some European cities, there is a decline of solely vegan businesses. And that's a very interesting trend in a sense that I would think that veganism is becoming more popular or more accessible. So I was wondering how it's going in the US, whether there's an increase, decrease, or how it's going in general.
I think we have to look at the restaurant industry, hospitality in general. The margins are thin as a rule. So while there have been, especially since 2020, a lot of restaurants that didn't make it, sure, vegan restaurants are closing, at an alarming rate. I think there's also an interesting viewpoint that as I see more, I'm going to say, traditional restaurants bringing on more plant based offerings, now there's that thought that me being the vegan in the family, I can go with my family to a traditional restaurant and get more than steamed vegetables and fruit as a dessert. And so there is that interest there that may be impacting, I would say, vegan restaurants. And so for vegan restaurants, I think that they have to really put a lot of emphasis on, or plant based restaurants, they have to really put a lot of emphasis on the deliciousness of the food, that it's not a second thought. I mean, vegan restaurants don't make it a second thought, but they have to be top tier. I just went to a restaurant in New York, a Mexican style restaurant, and everything was delicious. And I took someone that's not vegan, and they said, I can't tell it's not meat. And they were using a very popular beef type food that is soy and wheat gluten based, but they're using precision fermentation so they can get really specific on the texture and the pull, like a steak that we're used to. If you've ever eaten steak, I have. So I think, we see this experience of, yes, we want more non-plant based foods to offer really delicious offerings for anyone, because now plant based is becoming a default. If someone's gluten free, they may lean to plant based. Even though not all plant based is gluten free, they may know it's a safer. If someone's lactose intolerant, they know that plant based is going to be safer, and they can still have dip, or they can still have milk, plant based milk products. But I do see an alarming amount of vegan restaurants closing. And I think it's like any economical situation where the strongest are going to survive. And all of us have to step up our, I'll say, game in just really putting out the marketing and getting people more engaged. Because I put myself in situations where I'm probably the lowly vegan. This Friday, I'll be doing a grand tasting and serving 400 people. And I'm the only vegan chef there, and it's been this way for the past 4 years. But people now are kind of waiting to see what I'm going to do. And I'm going to serve a plant-based pastrami with house-made mustard and house-made, scratch-made pickled cucumbers on a pretzela bun. And no one is going to ask me, where's the protein? Because I've pretty much built a reputation for, you won't miss anything. But to that point, I do see vegan restaurants. I don't know. I haven't done a study yet to see if they're closing more than traditional restaurants. That would be interesting. Because as a vegan, and I get a notification of a restaurant I follow that they're closing, and I'm headed to LA and I want to go eat there, I really, focus in on that. But maybe there's two traditional restaurants closing for every vegan restaurant that's closing. There is a steakhouse group in Florida, and they've brought on a plant-based steak. And their sales of plant-based steaks are outperforming their regular steak. And I guarantee you there's not vegans going to a steakhouse. So, I think we have to, or I should look closer at what is really happening in the industry. But I think with anything that's growing, that's going to be a trend, you have to stay on top of your game. You have to keep pushing the envelope. You can't settle on your laurels. What was good 2 years ago is not enough today.
Fair enough. And I think also just relying on loyalty of a certain group of customers is also it's not that reliable as maybe it was back in the day when you had like one vegan restaurant in a city. Now when you have 10, they also compete, but there's also indeed I noticed that there's a vast difference between when I went vegan 8 or 9 years ago and now how many more vegan people I meet and how many more options there are in general. So it is, I think it's also it comes with expansion that there is more competition and that's how it works.
Right.
But I was wondering, because you said that at this event that you're going to, you're the only plant-based chef, and then you
Out of
rarely
20 chefs. Out of 20 chefs.
out of yes, exactly. So this is wow, the only one. And then you also very rarely hear about just plant-based chefs in general. I think you're the first one I actually met. And I'm wondering why is it so? Because again, I haven't done a study, I haven't read, I guess it depends on the place, but I would imagine again that veganism is becoming more and more popular, at least it's people are more open to it, at least seeing what it is. And I would imagine that for chefs, it's also more interesting to maybe experiment with vegan food. But you don't meet plant-based chefs or chefs that kind of specialize in plant-based food. And I was wondering, why is it so, whether plant-based cooking is not taught to chefs in culinary schools, or what are the other obstacles maybe that they have to face to become such? And then, if there's anybody listening to us who would like to be a plant-based chef, what advice would you give them?
Traditional culinary schools, some I'm watching are putting in a whole plant-based focused program. I think, again, this whole media trend, you watch The Bear, which is a series that, took off running. There's a lot of machoism with meat. And so a lot of my chef friends, male in particular, they, I think, like vegan across the board. Males will go, oh, that's soft. I can't build muscle. I can't continue to work out and compete. I came into veganism, natural bodybuilding, Venice Beach, which is world known with Arnold Schwarzenegger and other world famous bodybuilders. And my body one day decided it didn't want any more animal flesh or animal secretions. And I asked the question that I get asked most: where am I going to get my protein? And so I'm not afraid of that question. I love answering that question. I always ask them, how much time do you have? Because I'm going to take you down a road. But I think in general, there's still this stigma that we're not getting enough protein. We can't get enough protein. And I still feel women feel that way. And I think, there's four macronutrients: protein, carbohydrates, and good fats. And again, like kale is not king in the leafy greens division, nor is protein king. We need all of those macronutrients in a very balanced amount for the body to function at its ideal. I think as more studies come out to show that plant protein is probably more bioavailable and the body knows what to do with it, and it's not as hard on the body to break down animal protein, which is very hard on the body. So when we look at longevity and we look at what it takes our body to take in certain nutrients, I think more studies are coming out that way. With regards to school, I went to two culinary schools. One was all vegan, raw vegan. We didn't have ovens in our kitchen. We just had floor to ceiling dehydrators. So we cooked nothing over 118 degrees. So all the enzymes based on the theory were kept intact. And we all know we need enzymes because they're the worker bees that allow the protein, the carbohydrates, the good fats, and everything in between to work properly. And then the other culinary school that I attended was a macrobiotic based school. So while they taught us, because they were a state school, so they have to keep their license and teach by state regulations, we could opt out of the week of poultry and fish and, beef. I didn't opt out because I wasn't born into veganism. I've been vegan over 20 years, but what I found, most of the students that weren't vegan were the ones that were most afraid to do what you needed to do to break down the chicken or break down the fish. And I was like, what are you guys talking about? You want to eat it, but you don't want to do what it takes to get it on the plate. And I think that is the problem. If everyone needed to go out and, source their food and hunt like maybe our ancestors did, it would be a different beast. And the fact that we are privileged today to see meat in the store and not have to worry about where it comes from or how it got on our plate. I mean, there's a lot of ultra processing in meat. There's dyes used to keep it looking red. And so I could go and talk about that for an hour, but I'll zero back around to the culinary schools. I think there's a stigma. And the other thing is, for us plant-based chefs, are there jobs out there for us? I have plant-based vegan friends that work in traditional kitchens because they have to survive. So I've chosen and made my life career of letting people know I don't cook meat, I don't cook fish, I don't cook poultry. And I'll always get someone to say, but you don't have to eat it, you can still cook it. I'll get casting directors calling me saying, oh, we've watched you and we'd love you to be on this show. And up front, I'll say, I do not cook with dairy, any animal secretions. And then there's just silence. And I always have to say to them, when you guys are ready to really do full on plant based, let me go up against the non vegan chefs and let me use the proteins I use and the ingredients I use. And then let's decide there. Our society, well, media is just not ready for that because most of the people that have these positions are meat eaters.
That's true. That's true. But yeah, I mean, you mentioned a lot of very interesting things, but to me, it's also interesting how, and that also, you mentioned that before with health, how a lot of people just wake up with aches, and but then switching a diet is a fearful thing for them because they are afraid that they won't get enough protein or just they won't be healthy. And that's a very interesting thing because I know a lot of people and myself how vegan diet actually helped me deal with my health issues. So I'm a walking example that's the opposite, and I like to use this argument a lot. But indeed, we could be talking about examples of this for hours. But we need to wrap up because we have a lot of questions from the audience. But before that, I just wanted to ask you a very quick, 30-second quick shot about the future of vegan market in 20 years in the US or worldwide. I know I'm giving you a hard task, 30 seconds or a minute, but maybe you can do it. Where do you see us in 20 years?
The Good Food Institute has predicted that by 2040, 60% of the foods on our shelves will be plant-based. So I'm leaning into that because I think it's a huge possibility with the direction that we're going. I think those that are going to be strong in meeting the needs and demands with nutrient dense food and foods that really deliver versus, a food that gets on the market. You and I, and I'm sure everybody on here has bought something and said, how did they get funding? Because it just not doesn't meet our standard, whether we're vegan or traditional eating people. So I have, and I shared this the other day, I believe that we'll see more stores, 60+% of plant-based foods. I mean, we already have produce. So, we can say already we're there. People will say, oh, I could never go vegan. And I'm like, but you're eating a lot of vegan food, and orange is vegan. And some marketers, market that with stickers to point out it's vegan. So I am very hopeful for the next 20 years. And I truly don't think it's going to take 20 years to see some of these predictions come to life.
Hope so too. I hope so too. But yeah, I think we make like uh, far in the future predictions, but oftentimes the market and and people surprise us positively. But as I think you mentioned, and as I think kind of stood out from this conversation, we need to meet people where they are and try to understand them and make it easy for them, and they will follow. And I have exactly a question, so we could maybe open a Q&A with this because there's a question that actually leans into this kind of meeting people and convincing them with positive examples. Sarah wrote, "Wonderful chat. The images on your food of your food on Instagram look so incredible. I hope I
Thank
can
you.
try your food someday." And Sarah was wondering, what are some of your favorite foods to serve non-vegans to make them realize how great plant-based food is?
I always ask someone what's their favorite food. There's an easy question to find out what they love. I quite love Mexican food. I could eat a taco a day every month and never repeat the same fillings. And maybe I'll do 31 flavors like Baskin and Robbins only with tacos. So, my favorite food to feed people trying to transition is the food that they like most, because that's the largest impact I can have on truly showing them they won't lose flavor, they won't lose texture, they won't lose taste. It won't impact their culture. It won't impact their generation and their ancestors and their grandmother's favorite recipe. I mean, there's more than just the food. There's this connection to culture and connection to our ethics also, especially, as I said earlier, every cultural food. I mean, look at India and, just around the world, dive into their culture of food. And I always do that. And I find that's very successful because most people just say, I just didn't know. So my advocacy is to imagine people just don't know. And it's my job to let them know.
All right. There's another question from Harsha, and I really like the phrasing of it because it starts with how do we deal with? It's not how do you, how should I, but it's how do we as a group deal with? And I really like this phrasing. How do we deal with highly processed, inorganic, and natural argument against a lot of vegan food products? I realize that everything or nearly everything is a chemical and processed to some degree, but people just seem to apply this to vegan foods. For example, everybody says salt is okay and natural, but MSG is not because it is chemical. It's monosodium glutamate. I'm sorry if
Yes.
I'm not pronouncing this
Yes.
correctly.
Yes.
But easily forget, and this is basic school chemistry. So how do we deal with argument? Because as you mentioned, a lot of meat and animal-based products are not, they are not non-processed. They are processed, sometimes more than even this artificially looking vegan substitute, which might have a better ingredient list. So how do we deal with this?
I won't get too hard into MSG, but that was a political attack on a group of people. MSG is found in natural sources. Of course, it can be synthesized, as most things can. And I am not a proponent of ultra processed foods, be they vegan or not. There's a lot of ultra processed foods out there. I'm an advocate for whole plant based foods as the bulk of our food. And then, to every so often, if you need a chip or something, I'm not such a sweet tooth. I like chips. I like tortilla chips, actually, not even potato chips. But I also monitor it. So I think as a group of people, we do want to lead people to more whole foods. We don't want kids to see a potato and say, oh, that's a French fry. We want them to identify it's a potato and French fries come from potatoes. And that was the work that I did with food literacy that I got so much pleasure out of, that these kids just hadn't seen so many of these foods because they don't have access. So access is a huge part of people realizing what's available at their farmers market with CSA boxes. So I think we have to keep pushing the envelope that people understand that mustard comes from mustard seeds and, ketchup comes from a tomato, but a tomato isn't ketchup. And that's how I approach it. I also want to say at this point that, our generation, between Generation Z, the universities that are saying that, by 2025, 2030, they're going to have plant-based as default. So with each generation, we see, I think, this elevation. So I lean in heavy to the future of young people that really want to have a better life, that may not be wanting to call themselves vegan as a label, but just want to eat better foods for their sustainability. And I think that's a huge component with the success that we'll see with plant-based foods continuing to grow.
All right. Thank
And the
you.
debate.
Yeah. I hope I have a lot of faith in young people and how they approach certain things, especially because they feel the pressure of the need to change. And if we package veganism and plant-based food well, I think they can be very open to it. But that's a prediction for the future. Let's now move to the very abstract situation. We got a very interesting question. Nina, I hear all the time you are vegan, but one day you will be alone at a remote island and you will have to eat animals. Can you tell people what we can eat if we are stuck and stranded on a lonely island somewhere in the middle of the ocean?
Yeah, if you have animals on an island, you can believe you're going to have a plethora of vegetables because animals eat vegetables. They typically don't. Maybe lions and tigers are different. But I would have no worries of being stranded or happily there on an island with animals and sharing their greenery and their fauna and their berries and their seeds and learning what they eat and how seeds get carried from one place to another because of the birds and all. I would never feel that I'd be on an island where there were animals, where there weren't plants. It's not in nature.
Fair enough, fair enough. Nina just ended this debate. That's it. It's actually very good way to answer this question, not even deflect it, just answering. Yeah, I don't see any more questions. I think this is the last minute to submit it if something came to mind. But we have we touched upon a lot of topics today. Thank you, Nina, for answering the questions so comprehensively. I think it painted a very good picture of the US for me as a person who has never been to the US, only hears about the US from the media, which of course, as we know, is not always very reliable. And yeah, it made me think a lot about what I eat. And I think it's also a good maybe thing to say, you can correct me, but we should, for our own sake, but also for the sake of others, lead by example. So maybe I should stop eating a lot of processed foods every day just because I'm lazy, because there are so many amazing things I could cook and impress people with. So yeah, I think that's also a good takeaway, at least for me, to take from this conversation.
One of my favorite sayings as we close is from Anne Wigmore, who ran the Hippocrates Institute in Florida. And she really helped people that the doctors just didn't know what to do with, that basically told patients to go home and die in peace. And so many of these people, were cancer patients. And one of her quotes that I love is she would say that food can be, and she's plant-based, vegan advocate, food can be our strongest force of medicine. Food is medicine, or it can be our slowest poison, the foods we choose to eat outside of plant-based. And I think when we stop and think about, are the foods that we're eating giving us life, or are they extracting life from us? And I think if we all look down at our plate today, whether it's a little bit late for you at dinner time or tomorrow for breakfast, if you would just look at the food and ask what's on your plate, are you giving me life or are you giving me death?
And did you take life from somebody else. I mean, doesn't apply to vegans gathered here, but that's also something that, um, yeah, a lot of people actually have that realization that I think it has to hit you at some point that you are eating somebody else's life to really change something in your brain and have you open to veganism, definitely, and without looking back.
Yeah, and media and marketing and companies have done a really good job in hiding, how many visuals I've seen of an animal's throat being slit or the torture. I don't think I know most people don't want to see that because it is a hard ethical decision on their part because they just haven't reached that for themselves. So I lean in with compassion and I keep just being there for them because I find every day in my experience, someone says, okay, I'm ready. I need help. And then be there as vegans. Let's be there to help them and not chastise them. As much as I would like everyone to stop eating animal flesh and animal secretions and using animal byproducts, we have to come to the realization beating people over the head usually isn't the way to do it. My grandmother always taught me that I would get more bees with vegan honey. Actually, she didn't say that, but I know that the sweetness of vegan honey, and we do have vegan honey today that um, maps or I is the identity of honey in its makeup that we have almost everything and we're continuing to grow with that. So those that are listening that are vegan, those that are listening that are considering transitioning, those that are vegan 9 to 4, those that are vegans or flexitarians, you're doing so much, so keep going. And I thank you for that. And I thank you for tuning into this session. I've had such a great time. And I know when I get off, Lena and everyone else here, I'll have, oh, why didn't I say that? Why didn't I say that? But you have to give people so much. And I hope I've given you something to leave with that inspires you that whatever walk you're taking right now, we can always be better than our best each day.
It's a beautiful way to close. Thank you, Nina. And thank you all for tuning in.
Thank you.